Hello, welcome to second semester World History and our new unit, Industrial Nationalism. We are combining the topics of industrialism and nationalism to try to understand how both of them assisted in and helped to develop the colonial new imperial system in Africa. Today isn't day one. We're talking about industrial labor and the transition from slave labor into factory labor. We'll move from there into the economics of it and Marxism. Then from there, we're going to look at several days of different nationalist movements, different nations combating against each other. First Britain versus the Zulus, then Belgium versus the Congo. Then we're going to move on in day 7 and 8 to South Africa, where we talk about the British, the Boers, and Black South Africans. And then the last segment of this unit will be the conflict between Germany and the Herero people in Southwest Africa. Today's first question is kind of an interesting one. It's kind of review from last semester and trying to tie it all together with some new information. The big question is, why did abolitionism become more popular in the 1800s. The enslavement of African people had been happening ever since the 1400s, and in the 15 and 16 and 1700s, millions of Black Africans were moved from Western Africa into the Americas. So why did the abolitionist movement, the movement to end the enslavement of those people, increase in popularity in the 1800s? It increased in popularity partially due to publicity, partially due to the publicity received by a couple of different events. The first event is the creation of these two new colonies, the colony of Sierra Leone and the colony of Liberia. Sierra Leone and Liberia were both created for the same sort of reasons. Abolitionists wanted to free the enslaved African people or people of African descent, but white people in Britain, Canada, the US, etc., were not okay with the idea of cohabitating, of living with Black people in their societies. So, okay, free the slaves, yes, but racist people didn't want Black people living in their societies. The abolitionists' plan was quite simple. Colonize Africa with Black people of African descent who were born in the US, Canada, Britain, the Caribbean, etc. Black Londoners, people from Nova Scotia, mostly Black people who had escaped from the US, who lived in Canada, also Black people who had escaped from slavery in places like Jamaica, were taken together into a settlement in what is now called Sierra Leone, this country in red on the map. Britain created a colony and put Black people there. The British talked about it like they were going back to Africa. However, most of these people weren't really from Africa in the first place, most of them being born in Britain or America. Similarly, US abolitionists came up with the same idea: send Black Americans to Liberia. So starting in about 1816, the colony of Liberia was organized by a group called the American Colonization Society. They were partially led by the guy who would later become president, James Monroe. They created the colony of Liberia, named after the idea of liberty. And they set up a colony here, capital Monrovia, named after President Monroe. And Black people from the United States were moved here. Most of the settlers of these colonies ended up dying either of disease right after arriving, since they weren't from that area, or from warfare with the local people who did not appreciate being colonized, whether it was by white people or Black people. It doesn't matter. If someone's kicking you out of your home, you're not going to be happy. A couple of other things happened at the same time period to raise the status of enslaved people and to make abolitionists feel the humanity of those who were enslaved, to feel like these enslaved people were really human. This guy first, Abdul Rahman Ibrahim ibn Sori, or otherwise known as Prince. Sori was captured in West Africa in his homeland of Fouta Djallon, and the Fulani people of Fouta Djallon had been at war with all of their neighbors, much like all of these nations in West Africa had been for hundreds of years. During that war, even though he was a prince, he was fighting in the war as a soldier, like you do, and he got captured. He was captured. he was eventually put on a boat and he was brought to the United States as a slave. All along the way, he protested, saying, "No, you don't understand. You got the wrong guy. I'm the son of the king. You've got the wrong guy. You got to set me free." And his captors pretty much just made fun of him, giving him the nickname Prince, by way of making fun of his claims. Sori, though, an educated member of the royal family, spoke and read Arabic text, was a devout Muslim. He was brought to Mississippi and enslaved on a cotton plantation. Making the best of his situation, well, at first he rebelled and ran away, and etc. And eventually he resigned himself to the fact that he wasn't going to escape, and he made the best of his situation by becoming a overseer of his master's plantation. He made the cotton plantation productive. He made his master very wealthy. And after 40 years, he was married, he had children, etc. He ran into a guy named John Cox. John Cox was a British doctor who had known Sori in West Africa. This British doctor had been on a ship that had been shipwrecked off the coast of West Africa, and the Fulani people, Sori's countrymen, picked up the doctor, rescued him, and the doctor actually recuperated in the royal household. So he knew Sori from when Sori was a child. This British doctor went to the newspaper and vouched for him that this legend that he's a prince was actually true, and the newspapers gave it a lot of publicity, and eventually the story reached all the way to the national government, where the Secretary of State demanded that he be set free and be returned to his homeland. Due to some racist confusion, a lot of people thought he was Moroccan. Morocco's way up here. But Morocco was the only place that anybody could think of in Africa that they knew had Muslims. They didn't realize, racist thinking, that there were many Muslim believers all throughout West Africa as well. Eventually, he was able to get freed from his master after the Secretary of State demanded it. Through his fame and publicity, he was able to raise enough money to purchase the freedom of his wife, although he was not able to free his children. And he was put on a ship to Liberia. His master said he could be freed from slavery under the condition that he leave the US and never live there as a free man. He arrived in Liberia, intending eventually to get to his home in Fouta Djallon, and never made it out of Monrovia. He got a fever and died 4 months after arriving, as a fairly elderly man. And the last story I want to tell you about is this guy here, Josiah Henson, and his wife Nancy. Josiah Henson and Nancy Henson had been enslaved in Kentucky. They, through a series of crazy adventures, ended up escaping and walking from Kentucky to Ohio to New York to Canada. When they got to Canada, Josiah established the Afro-Canadian community of Ontario. In 1842, he set this up as a refuge for runaway freed people from the US. So I always wonder, the Underground Railroad, the runaway slaves of the United States are always running away to Canada. And the place that they're going is to the settlement established by Josiah Henson and his wife Nancy and their children in Ontario, a Canadian community of African descended people that's still there and thriving today. All of these things led to a lot of publicity for the humanity of African people, African descended people, Black people, people who were freed from slavery, people who escaped from slavery. Why did this movement expand and increase in the 1800s? All of these stories are part of the picture. Next question. On the other side of the globe, how did colonies like India show Europeans a different way to make money from their colonies, something other than just using slave labor on plantations? The way the British manipulated India was a lot more sophisticated than the way that they used African slaves originally in their colonies in America. Britain took over more and more areas of India and used indirect control and commercial colonialism to manipulate the people and the resources of India. They required the people of India to pay them rent, to pay them taxes. They required the people to grow cash crops, things like cotton and sugarcane, also things like opium later on that they would use to make money exporting into China. They didn't need to enslave the people because the people became sort of slave to the market forces. The commercial colonialism, the money, the commerce, the trade enslaved the people for the British. And if anybody wanted to rebel, the Sepoy army was there to enforce British rule. The British made deals with local leaders, local Indian princes, Maharajas, Nabobs, etc. Review from last semester. And so there was no need to enslave the people. You just kind of hold the whole country prisoner. You hold the whole country hostage via economic means, via trade, via commerce. This led to a lot of poverty in India, and the more poor and hungry and weak the people of India became, the more they were at the mercy of the British. Famines got especially bad in the 1870s. After the Sepoy Rebellion that we talked about last semester, things got even worse in India. If you were a starving person and you had the option to join the Sepoy army, you might consider it in order to save yourself and your family. And so those people who resisted found themselves increasingly impoverished. There's a trigger warning for the next slide. It's just images of some of the victims of the famine. So pause here to write your summary, and then I'll click to the next slide, and then I'll tell you out loud when I'm clicking to the following slide if you don't want to look at the images. Here we go. This is the famine in Bangalore in the 1870s. The British blamed the Indian people for their own starvation, even while continuing to demand that the people of India export and sell their food crops to Britain. Clicking away, and now you can open your eyes again if you close them. Question number 3. Why did the enslavement of African people become less and less profitable? If you are going to enslave workers, you have the scenario that's happening in these top 3 pictures. In the case of enslaved Africans, people were captured through violent means. They were sold to white traders at the coast of Africa. They were dehumanized. They were inspected. This guy's touching his face. He's handcuffed together. People were captured. People were purchased. People were forced to work on plantations. That work was enforced. It was punished. If you ran away, if you didn't work fast enough, people could be whipped and punished. And that punishment happened for people who tried to run away, for people who resisted, for people who worked too slowly. All of these systems required a lot of work. Capturing the people, purchasing the people cost money. Enforcing the work caused a lot of labor. It cost a lot of money in enforcement. And so much like the discovery that you could force people to do work without enslaving them, commercial means turned out to be more profitable. So we moved from this system of capture, enforced work, and punishment to this system of factory labor. And this is industry. Industry and factories are the same thing. These industrial workers were even cheaper than using slave labor. Slaves cost nothing, but they cost a lot in enforcement and a lot in their purchase price. Whereas wage labor, people you pay, you don't have to purchase them. And if they should get injured, you can just fire them and they're no longer your problem. If they should get old, if they should demand higher pay, you can just fire them and get someone else. The threat to do your work is simply the threat of losing your job. Rather than punishing people to stay on the job, the punishment would be to kick them out of the job. Child workers were used in textile mills, like we talked about last semester, increasingly, asked to work at faster and faster paces. They were injured quite often, and if you were injured, if you didn't die, you would be fired, and you have a number of people like this boy here, injured on the job, and then unemployed for life. The proof that this system is more profitable than this system, that factories are more profitable than plantations, that industry is more profitable than slavery, is in these two maps here. This is the US immediately before the US Civil War. These black dots are factories. You can see the northern states have a ton of factories, the south not so much. You can see the northern states have a ton of railroads, the southern less so. And so which area wins the Civil War? Not only does the North win because it's more profitable, but it's actually more powerful militarily as well. So enslaving people may have been profitable, but it was nowhere near as profitable as factory labor in the North. These factories made more money, and if a worker was injured, you could just fire them and not pay the cost. Those are our 3 summaries for today. Following this assignment is your independent practice reading assignment, and the question you should focus on is, how did industrialism make paying factory workers or miners more economically profitable, more financially beneficial, more money making than using slave labor in the British colonies? The reading assignment is in Canvas, and you should try to find evidence for answering this question in the reading and explain your answer.